Hello guys and welcome to another Hellfire Citadel Mythic Guide. Today we're almost at the last boss and we're gonna be talking about Mannoroth. He's back and he's not that strong, but he does get stronger through the fight. I'm Roger Brown and with me as always is Justway.
Hello everyone.
So Mannoroth is a pretty interesting fight, one of my favorites in this instance. Basically, although he keeps the same abilities throughout the whole fight, sort of, with small changes, each phase feels completely different from the other. So it's pretty cool to see how small changes actually impact your strategy a whole lot. In general, this fight is more about control rather than maximizing your DPS. You want to have smooth transitions, and the only time where you need to burst the boss is the last phase, of course.
Now because the fight is all about control, we're actually going to be running a different setup than most bosses. This time we're going to be running 3 tanks, 4 healers and 13 DPS. I think this is even the only boss in this instance where we're going to be using 3 tanks. Now in terms of DPS, it doesn't really matter too much what you're running, but it's recommended to keep using some burst AoE classes to keep up with all the adds that are going to be spawning in every single phase in this fight.
Now the boss has, again, 4 phases, just like Heroic, but there's a small difference between Heroic and Mythic, which is that phase 1 is completely gone from the encounter. So as soon as you start the encounter, the 3 casters, which you had in Heroic and you had to kill, they just die. They just sacrifice themselves for the greater cause. Yeah, don't ask me. But yeah, it's pretty good. You don't have to worry about dealing with phase 1, which is kind of boring, and you're straight into phase 2. Now, because this whole RP of the 3 casters dying and Mannoroth spawning takes a lot of seconds, it's basically useless to even pre-pot in this encounter. I mean, you can still do it and get like 2 or 3 seconds off on the boss with your pre-pots, but it's basically useless. So it's up to you. If you're a big spender, go ahead, but it won't really make any difference in the fight. Now, once the boss is up, you're in phase 2. There is a small difference between Heroic, which is that the pillars are not the same. So in Heroic, you have pillars in every phase. There is one that collapses, so you don't get the abilities that this pillar is doing. Now in Mythic, the difference is that in phase 2, you have the purple pillar. And what does the purple pillar do? It spawns the Doom Lords. The Gul'dan is going to be casting the Curse of the Legion, which is a debuff on a random raid member. And this debuff, once it gets dispelled, it will spawn a Doom Lord on the location of the player who had the debuff. And it will also deal a lot of damage on that player, almost a one-shot. So when you actually dispel this debuff, we need to make sure that that player has a shield or is using a personal cooldown or is getting some other external cooldown in order to survive that burst damage. Now, you might say, why don't we just ignore the debuff? Well, you're gonna get the Doom Lord no matter what, and the damage when it expires. So you might as well dispel it earlier, so that you start killing the Doom Lord earlier. And it's gonna be better timing if you almost instantly dispel that debuff throughout the rest of the fight, except a couple of occasions where you want to delay the dispel. But we're gonna get into that later. Now, this Doom Lord has 3 abilities. The first one, and the most important one, is the Mark of Doom, which I'm sure a lot of you who have done Heroic have probably wiped to this ability. Now, this Mark of Doom, it's going to be applied to 3 random members, and it's a debuff that, again, if it expires, the person with the debuff is just going to die. Now, what this Mark of Doom does is it has a circle around these guys that have the debuff, and any damage that they take is going to remove the debuff and at the same time trigger an explosion in that massive circle. So whoever is inside that circle is going to take a lot of damage. The way to handle it in phase 2 is to use the other ability of the Doom Lord, which is the Shadowbolt Volley. Shadowbolt Volley is just like any other Shadowbolt Volley in this game, just Shadowbolts to everyone in the raid. Now, because everyone is going to take these Shadowbolts, that includes the 3 people with the Marks of Doom, so they will take some damage and trigger the explosion, removing the debuff. Now, thankfully, the guys themselves with the Mark of Doom don't take any damage from that explosion, so they're not gonna die by getting the Shadowbolt plus the Mark of Doom explosion. Because these circles are so massive, you need to have proper positioning so that the 3 people who get these Marks of Doom have a place to go to explode by themselves. So in terms of positioning, what we did for phase 2 and worked pretty easily is have everyone make a tight circle around Mannoroth, really close, basically inside his hitbox, which is big, and whoever got the Marks of Doom just moved backwards towards the edges of the room. So there's a lot of room there and they can easily explode there without killing anyone else. Now, as I just mentioned, you want the Shadowbolt Volley to be casted by the Doomlord in order to explode these Marks of Doom, but this ability is actually interruptible. So you want to interrupt it every time that the Doomlord is casting it, except for when the Marks of Doom debuffs are up, because then you want it to actually trigger them. But other than that, make sure that you have an interrupt rotation and you don't let any other casts go through.
And the last ability the Doomlord has is Doom Spike. This is almost the same as in Heroic and Normal, that it just applies the stacking debuff on a tank, and the tank will blow up for however high the stacks are. Now the new mechanic in Mythic is that this explosion is actually going to be hitting everyone within 30 yards of the tank when he's blowing up. And this is the reason why we're using a third tank to tank these Doomlords and just move out of the raid once this debuff is about to expire. Now it's a good idea to always have the tank run in one direction, so everyone always knows where he's going to be blowing up. In our kill, in phase 2, we always had the tank run behind the boss, like directly from his tail towards the edge of the room. Now the next ability in this fight is also from one of the pillars. This pillar will actually be up throughout the whole fight. This ability is Fell Implosion. Now what Fell Implosion is going to be doing is it's going to be spawning a bunch of Fell Imps on top of the raid. And when they spawn, they're going to be dealing around 64k damage towards everyone in a 3-yard radius from where they spawned. Now for when these Imps are about to spawn, you want to make sure that you're inside the red hitbox or the red circle, the targeting circle on the ground of the boss when these are about to spawn. This is so that Death Knights can actually grip every single Imp on top of the boss itself. And this red circle is about the range of the mass grip, so if you're inside, you're going to be in range for the mass grip, and then all the imps will be gripped into the middle. Now you need actually 2 Death Knights to be able to grip every single wave of imps. Having a third Death Knight is not needed, but it's always handy to have a backup in case one of the Death Knights is dead or doing something else later in the fight. Killing these imps fast in this encounter is really important, because the new mythic ability this time is Phase Explosion. This will occur when the Fell Imps reach full mana and they Phase Blink. This will take about 11 seconds for them to reach full mana, so you have about 11 seconds only to kill these imps. That's why the burst AoE classes are really good on this fight, to keep up with these imps as they are there in every single phase.
Now there is one more pillar in this fight, the green one, which also spawns adds. These are the Dread Infernals. When they initially spawn, they will leave some green circles on the ground so you know where they're gonna land. And as soon as these Dread Infernals land, which by the way come in waves of 3, they will start casting an ability called Fell Hellfire for 10 seconds, which is self-explanatory, it's just damage around them. Just move away from them. Simple as that. And now after these 10 seconds have passed, they will cast an ability called Fell Streak, which means that they just reposition themselves. And again, you're gonna see the same circles like you did when they first spawned, in a different location. They're gonna target some random raid member and they're gonna jump on his location. So again, you just move away from them and that's about it. Just dot them up or have your ranged DPS kill them. The melee DPS should not attempt to go and kill them because they're gonna take a lot of damage and you definitely don't want that. Now there is one small thing which you need to be aware of, and that is that these Dread Infernals are also grippable. So if you have the occasion that imps have just spawned and you're mass gripping them, be aware that if there is a Dread Inferno, it will also get mass gripped on top of those fail imps. So just be ready for taking some damage if you're a melee and you're standing in there. Maybe use a personal cooldown, depending on the situation, of course.
Now that's it for the abilities from the pillars. Now we're at Mannoroth himself, and he actually does not have any differences from Heroic to Mythic this time around, in this phase at least. First up is Glaive combo. Just like in all the other difficulties, it's going to be doing a combination of Glaive Thrust and Massive Blast. First he does a Glaive Thrust, then a Massive Blast, and then another Glaive Thrust. Now Glaive Thrust is just a hard physical hitting ability that's going to be applying a dot if you do not have any active mitigation up, so the tanks will just have to make sure that's up. Massive Blast is the magical hard-hitting ability in this combo, and is going to be applying a debuff that increases the damage taken from further Massive Blast that lasts for 45 seconds. This is why you're going to be tank swapping after the Massive Blast has been cast. So the first tank takes the first Glaive Thrust and the Massive Blast, and the second tank takes the last Glaive Thrust in the combo. Now because Massive Blast also still knocks backs, it's important that you either have a tank that can charge or teleport back, or you need to make sure that you're back towards the pillar, or in case of phase 2, that you're standing near enough the middle so you can't get knocked off and you'll just land on the edge. The next ability Mannoroth does is Fell Hellstorm, and once you cast this, it's going to be calling down meteors on top of the raid. You'll see black, shadowy circles on the ground, and after a couple of seconds, a meteor is going to land there and deal about 95k damage to everyone standing in it. These circles are going to be targeted on top of players mostly, so if you're stacked up, there's going to be a lot of meteors on top of each other. Luckily, you're already spread out quite a bit, so you can just sidestep all the black circles that you see if you want to.
Then the last two abilities that the boss has is firstly the Mannoroth's Gaze. Now this ability is going to target 3 random raid members. They're going to get horrified for 4 seconds. What this means is that they're just going to be running away from Mannoroth. So depending on where you're standing, accordingly to the boss, you're going to get feared basically. You're going to start walking the opposite direction. So it matters where you're standing depending on the boss, and that's it. Now the 3 people who get this debuff, they will just start walking and not be able to cast any of their abilities. There are a few classes who can remove this debuff, meaning the Horrify, but the explosion will always trigger at the end of the debuff. So you don't remove the debuff, you just remove the Horrify effect. Well, some classes can do that. Just make sure that if you are planning to do so for example, if you're a mage, and you want to ice block it, call it clearly on TeamSpeak so that no one actually enters the circle and dies with you. Now because we are already spread all around the boss, this makes it a lot easier to handle these Mannoroth gazes, because when this explosion happens at the end of the debuff, all the damage is split amongst the people who are standing in that small circle that the debuff people have. So if you have 2 people inside that circle plus the guy who has the debuff himself, that's enough and you're not gonna die from that. That is the reason why we have this spread around the boss, because it makes it so that whoever gets the fear next to you, you're already really close to him and you just step into his circle and that's it. Now the last ability is the Fel Seeker. This is a pretty easy to dodge ability. It will target a random ranged member of the raid and it will spawn a small circle underneath him that explodes after 1 second or so. Anyone who is in that circle takes a lot of damage and also gets knocked away depending on where he's standing from the middle of that circle, the center of it. Now once this first explosion has been triggered, with the same location as the center of it, it will do a second explosion, but this time it will be 10 yards larger. And then after that explosion has happened, do a third one with an extra 10 yards. So basically it's just a small explosion, then a bigger one, and then a bigger one. It's pretty easy to dodge this ability once you've seen the first explosion, because you can predict where the second and third one will be, and you can just outrun it. The only people who should be getting hit by this ability is the first guy who gets targeted by this ability and is not too quick to react to it, but it's fine. He's not gonna die. He's probably just gonna get knocked off. So don't worry about it too much.
Now all of these abilities are not really that dangerous if you handle them all one by one. But there's one point in phase 2 where these abilities are going to be almost occurring at the same time. This is when the third Doom Lord is up. You're going to be placing the Marks of Doom on 3 targets, and then the boss is going to be casting Fear. And at the same time the Fears are going out, the Doom Lord is casting the Shadow Bolts to hit the targets with the Marks of Doom. So you need to make sure that there's some raid cooldown, or the raid is using personal cooldowns at this point to avoid any deaths from all the damage that's going to be happening at the same time. Now this phase 2 is going to be lasting until Mannoroth hits 65%. It's important to know that once you hit 65%, the Curse of the Legion will still trigger if there's less than 15 seconds left on the timer. So you want to push the boss when the timer of Curse of the Legion is above 15 seconds left. Now once the boss transitions into phase 3, Gul'dan is going to be destroying one of the pillars and giving Mannoroth back his skin and 1 extra ability for this phase. Now Gul'dan destroys the green pillar, and this also spawned the Dread Infernals before, so you're not going to be having any Dread Infernals from here on out. In terms of boss positioning for this phase, the boss will be moved towards where the green pillar just was, and it's going to be facing outwards. And if you do this, you need to make sure you have 2 tanks that can actually teleport back or charge back to the boss to survive the massive blast and not get knocked off. If you don't have any tanks that can teleport or charge, you have to consider that you have to face the boss towards one of the still existing pillars, and the other pillar is going to be used to avoid the Shadow Force and falling off.
Once you've entered phase 3, you're gonna get the brand new mythic ability, which is called Wrath of Gul'dan. Now, Gul'dan, he doesn't just stand there and watch you. He actually gives 5 debuffs to the raid. 2 go to melee DPSers, 2 go to ranged DPSers, and 1 will go to a healer. Obviously these targets are random, but you will always get 2 melee, 2 ranged, and 1 healer. So you can actually plan how this will be sorted out. Now what this debuff does is it starts with 40 stacks on this player. And if he stands by himself, nothing actually happens. But in order to get rid of this debuff, you need someone to go close to this player and soak some of that damage. Every second that this player stands next to the debuffed player, there will be a laser linked towards him, and he's gonna start stacking up a debuff that increases the damage taken from this laser. Now every second, the player with the debuff also loses 1 stack from this, from the 40 stacks that he started with. And once it reaches 0, the debuff is gone and you don't have to worry about it. Now this is actually quite a hard mechanic, and you need to actually deal with it properly. You can't just YOLO it. So what we did is we assigned specific players to deal with this debuff. As we're facing the boss towards the pillar that just despawned, on his right side, that's where the healer always goes with the debuff. And we have assigned 2 or 3 players who will go at that location in order to soak his stacks until he reaches 0. Now we have 2 and 3 people because obviously you can't just have one guy taking all the stacks, he's just gonna die because of the damage. And you need to rotate these players so that one guy goes in, takes like 6 or 7 stacks, then he goes out, the new guy comes in, and then the stacks are gonna fall off from the first guy and he can go back in. And now also you wanna consider the possibility that one of these players is gonna take the debuff himself, and that is why you need to have extra backup people for this job. Now this was just for the one healer with the debuff. Now moving on to the 2 melee DPSers, we had one of them do the exact same thing but on the left side of the boss. And then we also had the second melee DPSer go in front of the boss and a bit to the left of him, so right next to the tanks. And the tanks were actually the ones who were soaking the stacks from him, because obviously the tanks have a lot of HP and they can take a lot more stacks than a normal raid member. And now the last 2 people with the debuffs are the ranged DPSers. Now these people, we actually did not soak the debuff straight away. We just had them keep their debuff and had one of them go on the right side of the boss, far away from the raid, and then the other DPSer go on the left side of the boss, again, by himself. Now the rest of the raid were all standing on the boss's tail. So how do you deal with these 2 debuffs on the ranged players? Well, the good news is that Gul'dan will only cast this ability once per phase. So he cast it once at the start of phase 3, and you have the whole phase 3 to deal with this. You don't have to actually do it fast. So having the 2 ranged DPSers keep their debuff is not really a problem, because you can slowly get the stacks away from them by having some ranged DPSers move next to them, take like 3 or 4 stacks, and then move back to the raid. And if you just keep doing that slowly and steadily, you're gonna get rid of them, but it should not be a priority. It's not like a big deal if they have some leftover stacks when you enter the last phase. Now the reason why we have these 2 ranged DPSers keep their debuff is because you still get the Doomlords in this phase, because the red pillar is still up, so you still get the Doomlords. But we don't actually want them to cast the Shadowbolt Volley, because that's a lot of damage to the whole raid. And this time around we have another way to explode the Marks of Doom, which is the 2 ranged DPSers that have the Wrath of Gul'dan debuffs. So the guys with the Mark of Doom, they move away from the raid, go next to the people with the Wrath of Gul'dan, and just trigger the explosion there by soaking a stack from that laser, and then they can just move back into the raid. That is the reason why we have these 2 DPSers standing away from the raid, so they're just there to trigger the Marks of Doom, and the rest of the raid takes literally no damage from it.
Now, as we mentioned before, Mannoroth also gains 1 extra ability, and this is Shadow Force. This is again going to be pushing 3 targets back towards the edges of the room, away from the boss, and they're going to be taking ticking damage while they're afflicted by this. The way to actually survive and not fall off is to use the 2 pillars that we have still up. That's why we positioned the boss at the broken pillar, so there's 2 pillars available for people to move to. Now, as you mentioned, if you don't have tanks that can charge or leap or teleport back, you're going to be positioning the boss at one of the pillars. And if that's the case, you can always just move in front of the boss before the Shadow Force happens, or you can always get pushed into the other pillar that's still up. Now, one last thing for the Shadow Force, that if you're like a warrior or a rogue, you can use your abilities to actually stay on the platform. Rogues can killing spree or just sprint and just keep running against it, or the warriors can charge twice and just stay on the platform. Other classes also might have abilities that helps them, but in any case, if you don't have any abilities to do that, just go into the pillars.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning that the 2 ranged DPSers who have the Wrath of Gul'dan and are standing outside of the raid, they can also be targeted by the Shadow Force. So make sure that you are aware of when the Shadow Force is coming and be prepared to move instantly towards the pillar, because if you wait even 1 second, because you're standing out of position away from the raid, you're not going to make it. You're going to get pushed off the platform. Just be aware of it. Make a couple of steps maybe towards the pillar before it happens, and then if it doesn't target you, just move back to your original position. Now phase 3 lasts until the boss hits 35%, and you still get the Doomlords as we just explained. Now there is a bad timing with the Doomlords, and you are gonna want to delay one of them spawning. As we mentioned, it's up to you when you dispel the debuff, the Curse of the Legion, because if you dispel it instantly, like the rest of them, you're gonna get a really bad timing with the Marks of Doom, together with the fears and the pushbacks and all of that happening at the same time. Now, if you transitioned properly into phase 3 and you don't get the random Doomguard spawning at the start of it, which you shouldn't, then it should be the second Doomlord that spawns into phase 3 that you want to delay for about 15 seconds. So you want to dispel it towards the end of it. Now, other than this Doomlord and the timing that you have to dispel it, the fight is pretty straightforward in this phase. Again, as we mentioned, everyone is standing behind the boss, and you're still gonna get the imps, so you need to not be all clumped up together at the same spot. So have a loose spread while still being gathered on the boss's tail in order to spawn the fell imps. Now, once the fell imps are spawned, you grip them, kill them fast, and that's it. Also for the Shadow Force, that position works fine because you have enough time to move in either the right side or the left side, and you're gonna end up in one or the other pillar to avoid falling off from the Shadow Force. And then you still have the Fellseeker, which you should try to bait outside of the raid if possible. So any of your ranged DPSers can bait this away from the raid, and it's going to minimize the movement that people have to do in order to avoid it. So try to do that. And then also you have the Fell Hellstorm. Again, just loosely spread and try to avoid on the ground the black circles, the meteors falling from the sky. And then the last ability is the Gazes, the Horrifies, which again, since we're all grouped up on the boss's ass, you're all going to get feared towards the same location. So all you have to do is just follow the 3 people who got the debuff and just stand in their circles when they explode. It's worth noting that obviously the guys who have the Wrath of Gul'dans cannot get the Gazes as well, so they're safe, don't worry about them. Now, the last thing about this phase that is worth mentioning is that because of the timing of the abilities, you might get unlucky and get the Shadow Force, and while the guys from the Shadow Force are running back into the raid, you also get the imps spawning. So you might be unlucky and have some imps spawn far away and not be in mass grip range. That's fine, because all you need to do is just single target kill them, have your ranged DPS switch to them and finish them off. It's not really a big risk, because even if they reach full energy, which they'll probably do if they're outside of the mass grip, they will just explode by themselves, and the radius of the explosion is only 15 yards, so no one should actually die from this.
Now this time the boss will transition at 35%, and when this happens, you want to have cleared up any ads that are still up. Any Doomlords, any imps, you want to have them killed when you transition this time around, because it's going to be a race against the clock, as the damage in this last phase you're going to be taking is going to be higher and the room you have is going to be less over time. Now you also want the 2 ranged DPS with the Wraths of Gul'dan to actually get rid of all their stacks before you transition. But you want to make sure there's no more Marks of Doom coming, as that's the way to trigger them, and you don't want any Shadowbolt volleys to be forced off to actually get rid of the Marks of Doom. Now as soon as you hit 35% and you've cleared up the ads and all the Wrath of Gul'dans are gone, the first thing you do is Bloodlust in this phase. This is the time where you're going to be racing against the clock to kill the boss as soon as possible, and this is why we're using Bloodlust here.
Now, as soon as you enter phase 4, you have a few seconds where there's some RP going on, so you have, some free time to adjust your positions, and we're gonna slightly change our positioning. Basically, we're just gonna turn the boss towards the right, facing the purple pillar, and we do that because the tanks in this phase cannot use their teleports or charges when they get pushed back from the glaive combo. So you need them to get knocked actually towards the pillar or across the room, but still land on the edge of it. Now everyone else gathers behind the boss, directly on the tail of the boss again, including the 2 DPSers who had the Wrath of Gul'dan, and they should, if they haven't already, get rid of their stacks. Now the good part about phase 4 is that another of the pillars gets destroyed, and this time around it's the red one, so you're not gonna get any more Doomlords in phase 4, which is amazing, but you're still gonna get the imps. The bad part about phase 4 is that again Gul'dan is going to cast Wrath of Gul'dan on 5 new targets. Again, 2 melee, 2 ranged, 1 healer. Now there are multiple ways to deal with these Wrath of Gul'dans in phase 4, but what we found easier and way more stable without too much coordination needed is to just sacrifice the 2 melees. So unfortunately you're gonna have to spend a little extra money on the repairs, but it just makes the fight a lot easier to not have to deal with all 5 of them. So what we did is we had the 2 ranged DPSers who got the debuff move behind the raid, as you can see on the video, close to the blue mark, and we had one of the ranged DPSers with the Wrath of Gul'dan stand on the right of it, and one on the left of it. And then the two melees with the Wrath of Gul'dan, they just went and stood in the middle, right on the marker of the blue mark. And now what this meant is that the two ranged DPSers were shooting their lasers towards the melee DPSers, and also the melee DPSers were linking each other, so they were getting, again, more laser stacks. This, as you can imagine, ended up in their immediate death, and also by dying, they lose the debuff completely. So if you have the combat reses, you just sacrifice those two people, instantly combat res them, so they can go back on the boss, and that's it. You've handled 2 of the 5 debuffs. Now the two ranged DPSers who have the Wrath of Gul'dan, they don't go in the raid. They again stand outside and by themselves without linking to anyone, because that's just unnecessary damage that you do not want to take. And basically for the rest of the phase, they're just gonna stand behind the raid, on the side, and just DPS the boss from there. Now what about the healer? Well, the healer, because healing is super important in this fight, you need to have him survive, and what we did is just have him stand in the melee, and the third tank that we used to tank the Doomlords, since you don't have any Doomlords in this phase, he just went and took a bunch of stacks from him, and then the rest of the stacks you just randomly spread in the raid. It doesn't really matter because it's only one laser and you have everyone stacked there, so it's really hard to have someone die from it. Now, if you do this properly, you should basically be taking literally no damage from this laser, and then the rest of the phase is pretty simple, but also there's a lot of damage going on. So it's more about personal survivability and maximizing your damage.
Now what actually happens in this last phase with Mannoroth's abilities is that he empowers every single one of them. So they're all going to be doing some more damage or some different mechanic to it. The first one is Empowered Fell Hellstorm. He only casts this once in the phase, and this is at the start, and afterwards these meteors are going to be falling down throughout the whole phase until the end. And they're actually going to be increasing in intensity over time. So the longer you're in this phase, the more meteors are going to be falling down, and the harder it's going to be to actually avoid them and avoid any damage taken.
Sidestep King.
Next up is the Fell Seeker, that's now also empowered, and while doing the same thing as in the previous phases, and it's also going to be dealing some extra damage depending on the impact point of the initial Fell Seeker's location. Next up is the empowered Glaive combo. The Glaive Thrust and the Massive Blast will both be empowered in this ability. The first one, Glaive Thrust, is going to be a frontal cone now, and the Massive Blast will first of all stun the target. This is new in Mythic only, and this means you cannot teleport or charge, you can't remove the stun with anything. And secondly, it's going to be casting 3 empowered Massive Blast waves that are going to be moving outwards from the boss. The first Massive Blast wave will be directly in front of the boss, and the other 2 will be in a 45-degree angle from this point. Now these Massive Blast waves will have to be avoided by the tank getting knocked back. That's the middle one, because he's going to be knocked in front of it, so you need to run away fast after you've landed and the stun is over. But also the ranged DPS that might be standing outside with the Wrath of Gul'dan has to sidestep King, one of the 2 waves that are going to the side perhaps.
Now the last 2 abilities that get empowered in this phase kind of work together with each other. First off, you have the Mannoroth's Gaze, the Horrify, and now it works exactly the same like in the previous phase, but this time around, when it explodes, depending on how many players are in the circle soaking the damage, it will also leave a giant white pool of goo on the ground. Now, the more people that are in the circle soaking it, the bigger the white goo will be, taking up more space in the room of the fight. Now, what does this thing do on the ground? Well, it deals some small damage, which is almost negligible, but it also slows you by a lot. And this is how you actually handle the Shadow Force, because the empowered Shadow Force, instead of targeting only 3 players, it will target the whole raid this time around. So everyone is going to get pushed back, and the way you handle it is you get pushed towards the white stuff, and therefore you get slowed and not fall off the room. Now, although this white stuff is actually helping you, you don't want it to be too big. You want it to have a reasonable size. So you don't want everyone to just step into the circle and have a massive one spawn. The way we handled it is we had the people stand all behind the boss, but of course not on top of each other, because you also have the Hellstorm and all of that. But we had them kind of spread in a line behind the boss. And then what that meant is that the people who get feared will generally not be on top of each other, because if 2 people get the gaze and they're standing on top of each other and they are moving together, their 2 circles will be on top of each other, so cannot really do much about that. But if you actually do it properly and you have them stand in a line, you shouldn't have that. And anyone who is not feared will aim to enter the gaze circles, but only one of them at a time. So to make this clear, if I am not getting the gaze, my mission is to enter one of the circles, but only one, because they could be overlapping and you can soak both of them at the same time. You do not want to do that. You want to only go in one circle and soak there with some other people. Pay attention, this does not mean that only one guy soaks each circle. It means that everyone is soaking, but every single member only soaks one circle at a time. And now the only small difference is for the two ranged DPSers who have the Wrath of Gul'dan, and they are standing outside of the raid. Now, what do? Because they're not standing in with the rest of the raid, so they don't have any white stuff to get slowed. At this point, you want them to actually join the rest of the raid. So they will come in, but what about the lasers, you'll ask? Well, at that point, you want your hunters to move to the right side, where the two debuffed people are going to be moving, and these hunters are going to use deterrence and soak up basically the lasers instead of letting it hit random raid members. Now, once the Shadow Force is done, the two ranged DPSers move back to their position and the rest of the raid goes back on the boss. Now, the way the abilities work is you have the Mannoroth's Gaze, so you spawn the circles on the ground, then you get the Shadow Force, and then right after the Shadow Force, you get the Fel Seeker. Now, it's very important that you spawn this Fel Seeker away from the boss. So all your ranged DPSers need to stand on the side or in some corner, anywhere but on top of the boss. Doesn't really matter, because right after the Fel Seeker, you're going to have the Imps spawning. So as soon as you've spawned the Fel Seeker, hopefully away from the raid, everyone moves back inside the boss in order to spawn the Imps, mass grip them, kill them, and then it's a rinse and repeat fight. The only difference is that the boss should be dragged around the side of the room, because as you can understand, you have the white circles on the ground, therefore you need to move the boss backwards, let's say, so the tanks basically just backpedal a little bit to give some more room for the rest of the raid.
Yeah, the movement you do with the boss is that every time the boss casts Mannoroth's Gaze, you just move it clockwise like 20 yards. That should be enough to leave some room between the white stuff and the boss, and it will give room for people to move back after the fears have been done. Now, one last thing about this phase is that even though you have one pillar left up, Gul'dan is actually going to be standing there and dealing damage around him, so you can't use it for any Shadow Force avoiding or any tank standing there permanently, as Gul'dan will just kill them with this AoE.
And that's all you need to know about this fight. Basically, it's a pretty slow fight in phase 2 and 3, but then in phase 4 is when, shit hits the fan and you need to pump the DPS and basically kill the boss before it kills you, because you can't actually survive all the damage happening for too long. Now, couple of tips and tricks that will help you in this fight is, as we said, throughout the whole fight, the Fel Seeker is going to target a random ranged player. So it's a good idea if you have mobile players, like for example hunters and maybe some healers that can move a bit more. They just move outside of the raid to bait the Fel Seeker. And okay, it might not happen and it might go on a ranged DPSer who is standing right in the middle of the raid. That's still not going to wipe you, but if you manage to bait it outside, if you're lucky, it's going to save a lot of movement, which will make the whole raid's life easier. So try to do it. Sometimes lucky, sometimes not. 50-50, I guess. Now, the second tip is that at the end of the fight, as we mentioned, you want people to soak the gazes in order to spawn the white circles on the ground to slow you down for the Shadow Force. But when you're taking so much damage and the boss is below 10%, if you get gazes at that point, you can just call on your voice comms to ignore these gazes. And what this means is that, well, sorry, but the 3 unlucky people who get these debuffs are just gonna die, because no one is gonna enter their circles to soak it. And that is to prevent everyone from moving, which means less DPS and less healing, and also taking all that damage, which again, you need to heal up. So you just sacrifice again 3 people for the greater good. So yeah, all in all, a lot of sacrificing going on, lots of damage at the end of the fight, and yeah, that's about it.
Now, before we wrap this up, there's a couple of debuffs you still want to keep track of in this fight. Now, the first one is Wrath of Gul'dan, that's going to be appearing at the start of phase 3 and phase 4. This will be the 5 players that are going to be shooting out the lasers towards the nearest player. The second debuff is the Gripping Shadows. This is the debuff that the players will be getting after they soak the lasers from the Wrath of Gul'dan. As it increases, they're going to be taking more damage from it, so you don't want to take too many stacks. Now, the last debuff is Shadow Force. You don't necessarily have to track this debuff, as you're going to notice that you're afflicted by it because you're getting pushed back, but knowing that you have it on you instantly is always better than knowing it too late.
And this brings us to the end of the Mannoroth Mythic guide. We hope that you're gonna kill this boss soon and have this amazing, rewarding feeling of managing to beat such a hard boss.
And now you'll be able to put your gaze on Archimonde's fight. So remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the future Archimonde guide is going to be here soon.
Yeah, see you at the final boss, guys. Good luck.